After the consultation, I reached into my tote bag to grab my car keys, and my fingers brushed something strange at the bottom. It was a folded scrap of paper, the kind you might rip hastily from the edge of a notepad. The ink looked rushed, uneven, as if the writer had been in such a hurry that he couldn't steady his hand. I smoothed it open with a little frown. 5 words stared back at me, sharp and desperate. Run from your family now. For a moment I laughed. Not out loud, more like that nervous laugh you make when the elevator jolts unexpectedly, and you tell yourself it's nothing. Who even writes a note like that? And why put it in my bag? I had just been at a doctor's appointment, a regular checkup, nothing unusual. The whole thing made no sense. And yet, as I sat in my car, staring at the letters, something cold crept into me. It felt as though those words had been written in fire. Before I go further, I want to ask something of you. If you've ever had a moment in life when your gut told you something was wrong, you know how scary and isolating it can feel. Sharing these stories is my way of reminding us that none of us are alone in those moments. If you take a second to like this story or leave a comment, it truly helps me keep telling more of them. Your support makes a bigger difference than you realize. And I'm deeply grateful you're here with me now. My name is Helen Carter, I'm 50 years old, and I live in a quiet town in Massachusetts, the kind of place where everybody waves at the mailman and the loudest noise most mornings is the garbage truck lumbering down the street. My life, at least on the surface, has always looked steady. I keep my little colonial house tidy, my kitchen sparkling, and my flower beds respectable enough that neighbors compliment me when they pass. People think of me as reliable, the kind of woman who shows up to bake sale tables with extra brownies, the one who remembers everyone's birthdays at church. That's who I believed I was, too, until life reminded me how quickly things can shift when the people closest to you stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a possession. My husband, Mark, has always been a charming man, the kind with a practiced smile that strangers trust. When we first met, I thought that smile was warmth. These days, it feels more like a mask. Lately, he's taken to reminding me of things I haven't forgotten. Helen, did you pay the gas bill? Or, don't forget your doctor's appointment. Little comments that carry the suggestion I'm slipping, even when I know I'm not. He insists on helping with my pill organizer, saying it's just easier if he lines everything up for me. And though I've always been capable of managing my own medications, I let him do it to keep the peace, telling myself it's just one of those quirks of marriage. Then there's Bianca, his daughter from his first marriage. She's in her late 20s, always on her phone, always posting about her hustle, though I'm never quite sure what that hustle is. She breezes into our house with big smiles, calling me Mom when she wants something and Helen when she doesn't. Lately, she's been making little jokes about me being tired, or about how maybe it's time I rested more and worried less about boring paperwork. It's all said with a laugh, but I can feel the edge underneath. And Paula, Mark's sister, seems to visit more than ever these days, carrying casserole dishes and casually dropping phrases about power of attorney or how future planning is so important. She says it like she's talking about grocery lists, but her eyes stay fixed on me as if she's measuring how close I am to agreeing. That morning before my doctor's appointment, I noticed something odd when I opened the pill organizer. It smelled faintly chalky, metallic, not like the usual clean scent of the bottles. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a change in manufacturing. Still, a tiny voice whispered that something was off. I ignored it. I wanted my life to feel normal, predictable. But then came that note. Run from your family now. The words burned into my mind. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it wasn't even meant for me. Maybe it was a mistake, a doctor writing down something unrelated, slipping it in my bag by accident. But as I sat in my car, clutching that paper, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been handed a lifeline, one I didn't yet understand. And when I walked into my house that evening, the air felt different, heavier, almost watchful. I didn't know it yet, but that note had just saved my life. The injustice of it all is that I had done nothing but live as a kind, steady woman. I had loved my husband, welcomed his daughter, smiled at his sister, and trusted them all. I never imagined they could see me as anything other than family. But what I was about to learn, slowly, painfully, was that sometimes the people sitting at your table are the ones planning to take the chair out from under you. And so, my story begins not with drama I created, but with the quiet betrayal of people who should have cherished me most. When I first tried to dismiss the strange note as a bizarre mistake from an overworked doctor, the rhythm of my everyday life immediately rushed back in. But this time it felt heavier, as if every glance and every word from my family carried a hidden edge. And by the end of the day, I was no longer able to laugh at the memory of those 5 words, because Mark came into the kitchen with his usual calm, carrying a neat folder that he set down in front of me as gently as if it were a gift. His smile practiced, and his voice smooth, as he explained that it was nothing complicated, just a set of forms the bank had requested, routine adjustments to simplify our finances, documents that needed my signature on a few yellow tabs. And while the words themselves sounded harmless, the way he hovered close to me, the way his hand almost pushed the pen toward mine, left me with the unmistakable sense that this was not a suggestion, but an order wrapped in charm. And I felt the blood drain from my face as I quietly pushed the papers aside, saying I would look them over later. Bianca burst into the house an hour later, the scent of her perfume filling the air before she even spoke. Her phone glued to her hand as she tossed her bag on the counter and chirped something about traffic. And when she finally looked up, she caught sight of the folder still sitting unopened where I had left it. And with a smirk, she began to tease me in that sing-song way she had perfected, saying how women like me shouldn't stress themselves with endless details, that I had earned the right to relax, that it was so much smarter to let the younger generation handle the boring stuff like bills and insurance. And while the words might have sounded generous to an outsider, to me, they dripped with a kind of impatience, as if she was already preparing to take over and saw my hesitation as little more than an obstacle. And before I could even respond, Paula arrived with her ever-present casserole dish, her apron still on, her face glowing with the pride of being helpful. And she launched into a monologue about how important it was for families to get their paperwork in order, about powers of attorney and healthcare proxies, and how heartbreaking it was when people waited too long, and the way she spoke so casually about matters that could strip me of independence made my hands shake under the table, because even though her tone was wrapped in kindness, her eyes kept darting to the folder like a hawk circling its prey. That night, when I finally escaped upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the pill organizer that Mark had so cheerfully placed on the nightstand, each compartment filled with pills that looked right but smelled faintly wrong, as if the chalky scent carried a warning I couldn't decode. And suddenly, the note in my tote bag felt less like a mistake and more like a flare shot into the sky by someone desperate to warn me. And I found myself replaying the doctor's every gesture during that appointment. The way he hesitated before leaving the room, the ink stain on his palm as if he had written something down in a rush. The odd glance he gave me when Mark returned from taking a phone call, the deliberate pause before he said goodbye. And I realized that maybe he had seen something in my blood work or noticed an irregularity in the way my prescriptions were filled. Something he couldn't say aloud, something that made him slip that paper into my bag with trembling fingers. And though my rational mind told me I was overreacting, my heart thudded with the knowledge that people who claimed to care for me were quietly surrounding me with documents, pills, and pressure I had never asked for. By morning, the pressure had doubled because Mark returned to the subject before I had even finished my coffee. His voice coated in sugar as he asked whether I had signed the documents, acting as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And when I said I needed more time to read them carefully, a shadow crossed his face, and the smile he wore stiffened into something that no longer reached his eyes. while Bianca groaned loudly as if my caution were a personal insult, muttering that it was exhausting dealing with people who couldn't keep up. And Paula, ever the helpful sister, leaned forward with her gentle hand on mine and suggested that perhaps she could review the papers with me, since it was easy to get overwhelmed at my age. And though I managed to smile politely and say I would handle it myself, inside I felt the doctor's warning pressing harder than ever, because I was beginning to see the outlines of something sinister. A husband who wanted my signature, a stepdaughter who wanted me out of the way, and a sister-in-law who wrapped control in kindness. And as they circled me like predators who had already tasted victory, I realized that the note was not a riddle at all, but the single thread I needed to hold on to if I wanted to survive whatever storm they were preparing to unleash. I often catch myself looking back to the early days when Mark and I first met, when life felt simple and trust came easily, and I can still remember the picnic blanket he spread out under the oak tree in the park, the way he laughed when the wind tried to steal the napkins, the calm patience in his voice, when he listened to me ramble about my dreams of fixing up an old house and filling it with laughter. And in those moments, I believed I had found a man who would never let harm come my way, a partner who would guard my heart as carefully as I guarded his. But now when I think about those memories, they sting like lemon on a cut, because the smile that once felt like sunshine now feels like a mask he has worn for so long that even I forgot to question what lay underneath. Bianca, too, was different once, a bubbly teenager who called me Mom without hesitation, whose eyes lit up when I taught her how to bake chocolate chip cookies, whose giggles filled the kitchen as we spilled flour everywhere. And I told myself over and over that love and patience could stitch together a step, family into something whole, that my kindness would eventually win her heart completely. But over the years, those bright eyes hardened into something sharper, and instead of looking at me with affection, she began to look at me with calculation, as though weighing what she could gain from me, and her once innocent teasing turned into jokes that cut deeper, little barbs about me being forgetful or slow, each one landing harder than the last, until I began to feel as if I were slowly being erased by the very girl I had once held like my own. And then there was Paula, who had always worn the face of the caring sister-in-law, the one who arrived with casserole dishes and stories from the neighborhood, who sat at my table sipping tea and nodding with sympathy as I confided my small worries. And in those moments, I believed she was someone I could lean on. But looking back now, I see how her questions were always sharper than they appeared, how she always angled the conversation back to finances or wills or health matters, how she smiled so sweetly while planting the idea that maybe I was carrying too much responsibility. And slowly I realized that the hands I thought were steadying me were actually guiding me toward a place where I would no longer have a say at all, and that realization was as bitter as any betrayal I had ever known. The cruelest part of this contrast is the way it tricks the heart, because every time I feel suspicion rise, my mind rushes back to those warm memories, reminding me of laughter and kindness and promises once made, and for a fleeting moment, I want to believe them again, to convince myself that I am imagining things. But then I notice the chalky smell of the pills or the weight of Mark's hand pressing the pen toward me, and I hear the echo of Bianca's dismissive laugh or Paula's soft insistence, and I know in my bones that I am not safe, that the family I once trusted without question is no longer the family I thought I had. And in that painful gap between past and present, I understand why the doctor risked so much to slip that desperate little note into my bag, because he saw clearly what I had been refusing to admit. The people I trusted most were preparing to use that trust as a weapon against me. When I forced myself to replay the appointment in slow motion, I realized how many details I had brushed aside in my rush to get back to normal life. And yet those small fragments now glowed like warning lights in my memory, because the doctor's voice had not been as steady as I remembered. There had been a faint catch in his throat when he reviewed my test results, a pause between sentences as though he were weighing every word. And the longer I thought about it, the more convinced I became that he was trying to tell me something without saying it directly. When Mark's phone rang and he stepped out into the hall, the doctor's entire posture changed, his shoulders straightening, his eyes darting to the door before fixing on me with unusual intensity. And then came that strange question. Had I noticed any difference in the taste or smell of my medication? A question so oddly specific that at the time I laughed nervously and shook my head, assuming it was just a routine inquiry. But now the memory landed like a heavy stone in my chest, because it was no routine question at all, but a breadcrumb dropped at my feet, urging me to look closer before I walked blindly into danger. I could see it so vividly now. The faint ink mark streaked across his palm, not the tidy smudge of a man jotting a reminder, but the desperate scrawl of someone who had written something down quickly. Maybe even the note itself, and tried to conceal it before anyone could notice. When he shook my hand at the end, his grip lingered a fraction too long, and though it might have seemed polite to anyone else, in that moment I remembered the subtle pressure of his fingers, the silent plea in his eyes, as if he were trying to anchor me in place and transfer courage wordlessly. And I realized he must have known that Mark was hovering close, ready to step back in, ready to cut off any private exchange between us. Even the way the doctor said goodbye seemed different. His words clipped, his jaw tight, his eyes lowering as though ashamed that he could not say more. And as I thought about all of it together, I felt the weight of his fear pressing against mine, because he had clearly seen something that terrified him enough to cross the line of professionalism and take the risk of slipping that note into my bag. That night, my nerves frayed, I locked myself in the bathroom with my pill organizer, the cold light buzzing overhead as I set every compartment open on the counter, and I spread the tablets in neat little lines, the way a dealer might spread a hand of cards, my breath shallow, my hands trembling as I compared each piece against the photo I had snapped for my pharmacy app a month ago. The differences leapt out at me once I stopped pretending. The morning pill that had always been a soft, pale blue was now chalky white with rough edges. The capsule I swallowed at night used to be smooth and seamless, but was now slightly discolored at the rim. And though the bottles themselves looked correct, their printed labels crisp and clean, I knew in my bones that what lay inside them was not the same as before. I even opened the trash bin and sifted until I found one of the older pills I had discarded weeks ago. And holding the two side by side under the light, I felt a chill course through me, so sharp it stole my breath, because one looked like medicine and the other looked like poison disguised in a familiar shell. For the first time since finding that note, I no longer thought of it as a mystery or a riddle, but as the lifeline it truly was. 5 frantic words written by a man who had chosen to risk his career to keep me alive. I pressed the slip of paper against my chest and felt a strange strength flow through me, a mixture of terror and relief, because now I had proof that my unease was not madness, but truth. And truth, even when painful, is always a kind of freedom. Sitting there on the bathroom floor, knees drawn up, the pill bottles lined like enemies on the counter, I whispered to myself that I would not swallow another thing without knowing what it was, that I would no longer laugh off the voice inside me begging me to pay attention. And even though the thought of confronting Mark and his family made my stomach twist, I also knew that by listening to the doctor's warning, I had already taken my first step back toward control. What I held in my hands that night was not just evidence, but a spark of hope. Because as long as someone else had seen the danger, I was not entirely alone. And if I moved carefully, that spark could become the fire I needed to survive. That evening, I moved through the house like a shadow, performing the same quiet routines I always did, but with a new heaviness pressing against every step, because once you've seen the truth hiding in plain sight, you cannot unsee it. And though I stirred the pot of stew and set the table as if nothing had changed, my eyes kept drifting to the glass of water Mark poured for me, and to the little white pills sitting ready in the tray he had so thoughtfully placed at my side, and I felt an invisible rope tightening around my chest. I excused myself halfway through dinner, claiming I felt full, but the truth was that every bite tasted suspicious, every sip seemed laced with menace, and I found myself pouring the tea he brewed into the sink when no one was looking, my hands shaking as I listened to the faint clink of liquid circling the drain, realizing that what used to be the comforting ritual of our evenings had become a performance where my survival depended on pretending. Later, when the house was silent and Mark's breathing grew steady beside me, I lay wide-eyed in the dark, refusing to take the pills he had left out, and for hours I waited for the wave of exhaustion that usually followed, the heavy pull that sent me into dreamless sleep. And when it didn't come, I began to understand just how much of my recent weakness might not have been age or stress at all, but the result of trusting what had been placed into my body. Around midnight, when my heart fluttered and then steadied, I knew with terrifying clarity that I had been walking a razor's edge, one dose away from a fall I might not have survived, and I pressed my hand against my chest, whispering gratitude for the doctor's courage, because without that slip of paper, I would have swallowed what was laid out for me and perhaps never woken again. As I lay there in the silence, the pieces fell together with cruel precision. The pressure to sign documents, the constant jokes about me being forgetful, the sudden eagerness of Paula to discuss powers of attorney, the way Bianca rolled her eyes whenever I asked questions, and even the subtle tightening of Mark's smile when I resisted, all of it forming a picture so grotesque I wanted to deny it. But there it was, undeniable in its clarity. They had been preparing me for a role I never auditioned for, the sickly wife, the fading stepmother, the woman too tired to notice her bank accounts drained and her home slipping into other hands. And I felt an anger rise inside me that cut through the fear like a blade, because nothing stings quite like realizing the people who should have protected you had rehearsed your downfall instead. And even in that bleak moment, with my body trembling from adrenaline and my mind racing with questions, I managed a small, grim smile. Because for all their planning, they had underestimated me, assuming that kindness meant weakness, that trust meant blindness. But I had seen enough to know better, and the very pills they had prepared to weaken me became the evidence that sharpened my strength. Humor, the kind only a weary 50-year-old woman can find in the absurd, slipped through my fear as I thought to myself that my eyesight might be bad enough to need readers for a wine label. But I could still count pills faster than Bianca could count her social media likes, and that simple truth made me feel less like prey and more like a woman ready to fight back. The morning after that sleepless night, I forced myself to move slowly, keeping the mask of routine firmly in place, but inside I was sharper than I had been in months, my senses tuned to every sound and every gesture. And when I picked up the shared tablet in the living room, the one Mark used to check emails and Bianca sometimes borrowed to shop online, I noticed his account had been left open, a small mistake born of carelessness. And though part of me hesitated to pry, another part whispered that if my family could invade my body with tampered pills, I had every right to invade their digital secrets. With trembling fingers, I tapped into the messages, scrolling past the usual bank alerts and news updates, until my eyes caught on a thread titled simply Plans. And what I read there made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The thread was a conversation between Mark, Bianca, and Paula, filled with casual little comments that would have sounded harmless if not for the context I already carried. Jokes about me checking out for a few weeks. Remarks about how once I was finally resting, everything would be easier to manage, and links to articles about elder care checklists and estate transfers, as though my gradual disappearance had already been decided, rehearsed, and all that remained was my cooperation. The words blurred as I scrolled, my hand pressed to my mouth because woven into their banter was the unmistakable outline of a plan that depended on me not questioning, not resisting, and certainly not surviving in full health. And I realized with a jolt that they were not waiting for chance to strike. They were orchestrating it piece by piece. Shaken, I turned to my bank app on the same tablet, and within minutes, I saw another crack in the facade of my supposedly shared life, because several transfers had been made from my emergency fund into a secondary account labeled Household, an account I had never opened, an account Bianca controlled with surprising freedom, and the sums were not small. Enough to cover deposits, purchases, and the kind of spending spree that left no doubt she had already been enjoying money that wasn't hers. I clicked deeper, my heart pounding, and saw a trail leading toward a real estate escrow, the beginnings of a condo purchase Bianca had boasted about to friends, but had never once mentioned to me. And in that moment, the truth solidified into something I could not ignore. My family had not just been talking about a future without me. They had already begun living off it. I sat back in the chair, the tablet heavy in my lap, the doctor's note burning in my memory, and I felt a strange mix of despair and clarity settle over me, because the betrayal was no longer hidden in smiles or jokes. It was written plainly in their own words, their own transactions, their own greedy anticipation of a life carved from my absence. Yet alongside the grief came a spark of determination, because now I had more than suspicion. I had evidence, the kind that could not be laughed away or twisted into misunderstanding. And I knew it was time to take the next step, to reach for help beyond the walls of my house. So with shaking hands, I found the number of an elder law attorney named Nora Kaplan and left her a simple, steady message. 5 words spoken with all the strength I had left. I think they're rushing me. When Nora Kaplan called me back the next morning, her voice carried the kind of calm authority that immediately steadied my shaking nerves. And she told me that in situations like mine, the worst thing I could do was confront my family too soon, because confrontation without proof would only push them to hide their tracks more carefully. So instead, she advised me to move slowly, to gather every shred of evidence I could, and to let them keep believing I was the same compliant woman they had underestimated for so long. I listened carefully, scribbling notes as though I were back in school, and I realized that what had begun as survival was slowly shifting into strategy, because if they thought they were writing the script of my downfall, I was about to rewrite it into a story of their undoing. Over the next several days, I followed Nora's guidance to the letter, moving through the house with a calm smile while my mind ticked away like a hidden clock, and I replaced the suspicious pills in my organizer with genuine ones from the pharmacy, tucking the altered tablets into small labeled envelopes that I hid inside a sewing box no one would ever bother to touch. I printed bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers, took photographs of the pill trays with dates marked, and even bought a small motion-activated camera that I tucked into the pantry, aimed at the kitchen island where most of our important talks happened, because Nora said that sometimes the most powerful proof came not from paperwork, but from watching how people behaved when they thought no one was looking. Each little step felt like slipping another stone into the foundation of a fortress I was quietly building around myself. At the same time, I began setting the stage in my own way, inviting trusted neighbors for casual visits and reconnecting with my book club friend Grace, who worked as a clerk in the county courthouse, because Nora reminded me that justice is stronger when the truth is seen by many eyes. So I baked cookies, poured coffee, and created an atmosphere of routine hospitality, all the while knowing that the very people who thought I was weak would soon find themselves exposed under the same light they had tried to blind me with. It was strange, balancing the weight of fear with the flicker of satisfaction. But in those small, deliberate acts, I began to feel my spine straighten, my heart steady, and my sense of humor even return, because I realized I was no longer stumbling in the dark. I was quietly setting traps in plain daylight. And if you've been listening this far, I want to pause to say something from the heart. Your support means more to me than you know, because every like, every subscription, and every kind comment is what allows me to keep bringing these stories forward. It may seem small, but for someone like me, sitting alone at a kitchen table surrounded by doubts and schemes, knowing there are people out there who care enough to stand beside me is powerful beyond words. So thank you for being here, for reminding me that even in the darkest plans, there are still people rooting for the light. With that strength behind me, I knew the time was coming to let my family believe they had won, right before the floor gave way beneath them. In the days that followed, I could feel the anticipation in my family growing stronger, like an approaching storm that thickens the air long before the first drop of rain. And I knew that sooner or later, they would push for another signing session. Instead of shrinking from it, I decided to lean in, to let them think they had worn me down, so I polished the house until every surface gleamed, laid out lemon cookies fresh from the oven, and set a vase of flowers right in the center of the dining table, as if I were preparing for nothing more than a friendly evening. And then I invited 2 of my neighbors who never missed a chance for free cookies, and my friend Grace from book club, knowing her quiet presence would carry more weight than they realized. It felt strange, preparing my kitchen like a stage, but I understood now that every performance needs an audience, and mine would not be one they expected. When Mark came home and saw the table set and the house spotless, his face lit up with triumph, the kind of smile a man wears when he believes the finish line is finally in sight, and he leaned down to kiss my cheek with a flourish that felt more like a victory lap than an act of affection. He asked if I was ready at last to get everything settled, and I simply nodded with a serene smile, hiding the spark of satisfaction that flickered inside me, because I had already rehearsed this scene in my mind a dozen times, and I knew exactly how I wanted it to unfold. Bianca arrived not long after, balancing a bright red folder in her manicured hands, whispering something excitedly to Paula as they stepped inside, their eyes shining with barely contained excitement, as though tonight was not about family unity, but about cashing in on a long-awaited prize. I offered them tea and cookies, moving about the kitchen with the calm ease of a hostess, while inside I studied every movement, every whispered aside, every impatient glance at the folder on the table. My neighbors settled comfortably into their chairs, chatting about garden clubs and church events, completely unaware that they were about to witness something far more dramatic than polite small talk, while Grace positioned herself with her phone at the ready, a detail none of my family noticed. The contrast between their eagerness and my deliberate serenity was almost comical, and I found a small thread of humor in the thought that I had spent half my life serving meals and coffee to these very people. Yet tonight, the most important thing I was serving was justice, disguised as hospitality. As we all gathered at the table and the notary arrived, carrying her bag of documents with a professional smile, I could almost feel the tension humming in the room like a live wire. And though my family believed the stage had been set for my quiet surrender, they had no idea that the scene was already slipping out of their control. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, my cardigan pockets weighted with the photos, the bank records, and the evidence I had so carefully prepared, and I looked at each of them with a steady calm that seemed to puzzle them, because for the first time in weeks, I wasn't shrinking under their gaze. I was ready, and they were about to discover what it feels like when the performance you thought you orchestrated turns out to be someone else's play entirely. The notary settled into her chair with the calm authority of someone accustomed to formalities, laying her folder on the table and smoothing her papers with precise little movements, and I could feel the shift in the air as my family leaned forward like gamblers, ready to cash in their final chips. Mark slid the first document across the polished wood toward me. His smile stretched so wide it almost looked painful. His voice soaked in syrup as he explained that it was nothing complicated, nothing to concern myself with, just routine housekeeping that every responsible family should address, and all I needed to do was sign where the yellow tabs were marked. Bianca perched beside him, her legs crossed, her manicured hand drumming an impatient rhythm on the bright red folder she had carried in like a prize trophy, while Paula hovered close with her casserole-sweet smile and her hand resting lightly on my arm, whispering about how this would bring peace of mind for everyone. For a moment, the pressure felt almost suffocating, as if 3 pairs of hands were pressing the pen toward me, their confidence radiating from every angle, convinced that after weeks of nudging, tonight was the night they would finally win. But instead of reaching for the pen, I reached into the pocket of my cardigan, my fingers brushing the evidence I had prepared with such care, and I drew it out slowly, deliberately, laying each piece on the table one by one, as though dealing cards in a high-stakes game. First came the photographs of the pill organizer, each compartment carefully dated with visible changes in the tablets, proof of tampering no excuse could easily explain. Then the small envelopes with the altered pills themselves, labeled and sealed, the kind of detail that could make any denial crumble. Next, the bank statements with the transfers highlighted, numbers circled in red ink, each transaction a nail in the coffin of their story. And finally, the printed screenshots of the group chat labeled plans, their own words staring back at them, casual jokes about me resting, and suggestions of how smoothly things would run once I was no longer managing affairs. The effect was immediate and devastating. The air seemed to crack open, and for the first time in weeks, they were the ones caught off guard. The notary froze, her pen mid-air, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to sharp attentiveness, and my neighbors, who only minutes earlier had been happily nibbling lemon cookies and gossiping about gardens, now leaned forward in stunned silence, their eyes wide as if they had stumbled into a courtroom instead of a kitchen. Grace, my steady friend, tilted her phone subtly toward the table, recording with the quiet grace of someone who understood the stakes without needing explanation, and when her eyes met mine, she gave the slightest nod, a signal that I wasn't standing alone anymore. I cleared my throat and spoke in a voice steady enough to surprise even myself, telling the notary that I would not be signing any papers tonight, that I wanted it clearly documented in her records that undue pressure had been applied, that my medication had been altered, and that funds had been siphoned from my accounts without my knowledge. As I slid the photographs closer to her for inspection, I made sure my words were crisp and deliberate, every syllable echoing across the room, because this wasn't only for the notary. It was for the neighbors, for Grace, for the camera in the pantry, and most importantly, for the people who thought I would never dare to speak so boldly. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Mark's practiced smile faltered, his lips twitching as he tried to summon excuses that refused to come, his voice cracking as he stammered about paranoia and misunderstandings. But his words landed weakly, drowned out by the weight of evidence spread across the table. Paula's hand slipped from my arm, her face drained of color, her eyes darting desperately toward Bianca as though begging her to salvage the scene. But Bianca's mask cracked too. She slammed her red folder shut with a snap so sharp it made the notary flinch, her cheeks flushed with fury as she muttered that I was making a fool of myself. Yet their anger only revealed their panic, because for the first time in this long, exhausting battle, the power no longer sat with them. It sat with me, with the truth I had laid bare for all to see. And as my neighbors sat stunned, as the notary quietly raised her own phone to record for her protection, and as Grace's calm presence anchored me, I realized the reversal was complete. I was no longer the hunted woman at their mercy. I was the one holding the light, and they were the ones shrinking from it. In the days that followed, the ripple from that evening spread wider than I could have imagined, because once the notary declined to proceed and quietly saved her own recording of the failed signing, the story no longer belonged only to me. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it, and those witnesses were more powerful than any lawyer my family could have hired. My neighbors, who'd been invited only for cookies and chatter, recounted every detail of the scene to half the town within 48 hours, their voices brimming with indignation on my behalf. And though I had always been the quiet woman who baked for bake sales and kept her lawn tidy, I suddenly became the woman who had caught her own husband, his daughter, and his sister, in a scheme so cruel that even the most cynical ears burned to hear it. Gossip became a shield for me, a strange but welcome form of protection, because nothing spreads faster in a small town than outrage mixed with scandal. And in this case, every whisper served as a nail, sealing their reputation shut. Nora moved quickly once I gave her the evidence, filing motions that froze the accounts connected to my name, halting the condo purchase Bianca had been flaunting online, and blocking any attempt to transfer ownership of my house. Within a week, the bank had reversed several of the unauthorized withdrawals, and I had affidavits from the notary, Grace, and my neighbors, all neatly signed and ready to be submitted should this ever escalate further. I even sent a copy of the photographs and pill samples back to my doctor with a handwritten note thanking him for saving my life, and he replied with a short letter expressing relief that his warning had not gone unheeded. It was in those moments holding that letter, seeing Nora's determination, and watching the smug certainty drain from my family's faces that I felt the deep satisfaction of knowing the web they had spun so carefully had collapsed entirely under the weight of their own arrogance. Mark, once so confident, began to unravel almost immediately, his voice growing sharp and defensive as he tried to insist that everything had been a misunderstanding, that the transfers were simple bookkeeping errors, that the pills must have been a pharmacy mistake, and yet his excuses rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. And worse for him, they rang hollow in the ears of the neighbors who now looked at him with open disgust. Paula retreated into silence, canceling her frequent visits, no longer arriving with casseroles, but instead with pale excuses about being too busy, her name muttered with disapproval at church gatherings where once she had basked in admiration. And Bianca, whose bravado had carried her so far, found herself humiliated as her condo deal collapsed, and her friends whispered about how she had been caught red-handed, her pride replaced by sulky avoidance and bitter posts online that no one took seriously anymore. Their downfall was not a single blow, but a slow unraveling, each thread pulled away by truth, until the fabric of their scheme lay shredded for all to see. And through it all, I remained steady, my voice calm, my head high, my every action measured and deliberate, because I understood that true justice is not only about punishing the guilty, but about restoring balance to the innocent. The satisfaction came not from shouting or gloating, but from the quiet, undeniable reality that they could no longer touch me, that the same community they had hoped would turn a blind eye was now watching them with sharp scrutiny, and that every door they tried to open would slam shut because of their own choices. For the first time in months, I slept deeply, unafraid of what might be slipped into my tea, unafraid of the papers they waved at me, and unafraid of being erased from my own life. Their shame had become my shield, and the culmination of their plan was not my downfall, but their undoing, a public consequence so fitting that even karma itself must have smiled. When I look back now, I realize the most powerful change was not simply that the scheme against me collapsed, but that something inside me quietly shifted forever, because for so long I had been shrinking without noticing, lowering my voice when Mark dismissed my concerns, second-guessing myself whenever Bianca rolled her eyes and joked about me being forgetful, and letting Paula's patronizing kindness convince me that maybe I really was too tired to handle everything. That slow erosion of confidence had been their greatest weapon, and I had been handing it to them piece by piece until that night at the table when I finally saw myself reflected in the eyes of my neighbors and in the notary's silence, and I understood that I was not fragile at all. I was standing taller than the people who tried to reduce me. From that moment, I stopped carrying the shame they had pressed into me and began to carry only my own dignity, which proved far heavier in the best possible way. The doctor met with me again a few days later, his face softened by relief rather than worry, and he confirmed what my instincts had already screamed to me. The inconsistencies in my blood work, the changes in my prescriptions, and the odd refills were not accidents, but red flags that could not be explained away, and that was why he had taken the enormous risk of slipping that note into my bag. Hearing him say aloud what I had only whispered to myself was like being given permission to believe my own reality again, and I thanked him with tears I hadn't expected, realizing that sometimes the smallest act of courage, an ink-smudged palm, a desperate scribble of words, can save a life in ways no grand gesture ever could. Together we filed an incident report with the pharmacy, attaching the altered pills I had carefully saved, and as I signed my name at the bottom of the form, I felt stronger than I had in months, because my name was no longer a thing they could steal or diminish. It was mine, steady and sharp in black ink. Back at home, I remade my life with deliberate hands, changing every lock on the doors so the keys rattling in Mark's pocket no longer held any power, resetting every password until even Bianca's clever fingers couldn't guess them, and enrolling in transaction alerts that chirped on my phone whenever $1 left my account, each ping like a little drumbeat, reminding me that I was once again the keeper of my own life. For the first time in months, I cooked dinner without dread, humming as I pulled a golden casserole from the oven, and when the smoke alarm overreacted and shrieked for no reason, I laughed so hard I had to sit down because the sound no longer frightened me. It felt like my house cheering me on. Humor slipped back into my days in unexpected ways, the kind of dry humor only a 50-year-old woman who has lived through betrayal can carry, and I found myself thinking that perhaps the best revenge was not anger, but laughter, echoing in a kitchen they once thought they controlled. And as the weeks passed, the balance of power didn't just shift. It flipped so completely that it was almost startling. Mark, once striding through rooms with the ease of a man convinced his word was law, now avoided my eyes and muttered half-hearted excuses, a guest in the very house he once ruled. Paula, who used to lecture me about planning for the future, kept her distance at community events, her head bent low as neighbors whispered behind her back. And Bianca, who had strutted in with folders and smugness, now walked smaller, stripped of her condo and her confidence, her sharp tone dulled by humiliation. They had become the ones shrinking, making themselves small and forgettable, while I, the woman they had tried to erase, discovered a steadiness I hadn't felt since my youth. Weakness had been an illusion painted on me by their greed, and now that the paint had washed away, all that remained was the steel beneath. A woman who would never again apologize for her strength. When Bianca appeared on my porch a week later with a bouquet of lilies clutched in her arms and an apology rehearsed on her lips, I almost laughed at the predictability of it, because the same girl who once rolled her eyes at my every word was now standing small and hesitant, hoping to charm her way back into the very life she had tried to dismantle. I listened to her carefully chosen sentences, her voice faltering as she spoke of misunderstandings, of how she hadn't meant harm, of how she simply wanted the family to be closer. And though the lilies looked fresh and her smile looked polished, her eyes betrayed the desperation of someone who knew her reputation was in tatters. Instead of anger, I felt a surprising calm, as though her words could no longer touch me. And when she finally ran out of excuses, I slid a folder across the table containing the papers for the new living trust I had created that morning, a document that placed the house solely in my name and directed its future equity to a scholarship fund for young women in need, a plan that secured my life's work away from greedy hands and toward a cause that would outlast us all. The look on her face was almost comical. Confusion first, then dawning horror, and finally the hollow acceptance that there would be no inheritance to claw after, no sudden windfall to justify her cruelty. I told her in the gentlest voice I could manage that the best gift she could give herself now was to build a life not borrowed from someone else's ruin. And though she tried to protest, the words faltered before they left her mouth, because the truth sat heavy between us, and she had no weapon left to wield. Mark's absence that day spoke louder than her presence, for he had already packed a suitcase and retreated to his sister's spare bedroom, unable to endure the humiliation of facing a wife who had slipped through his grasp, and Paula's silence in the days that followed was an admission louder than any apology. Their empire of control had collapsed completely, and in its place I had built something far sturdier, a foundation of independence that no one could steal again. What surprised me most was not the collapse of their scheme, but the way the community responded, because in a small town every story travels, and mine traveled with a force I could never have orchestrated on my own. My neighbors who had witnessed the showdown at the table told the story again and again, each retelling painting me not as the victim they once pitied, but as the woman who stood her ground and turned betrayal into justice. And the respect in their eyes when they waved at me across the street became its own quiet victory. Even the whispers at church, once filled with speculation, now carried admiration, and for the first time in years I felt not only safe, but celebrated, as though the entire community had joined me in drawing a line in the sand, promising silently that those who had tried to erase me would never find a way to rewrite the truth. That public knowing was the sweetest shield of all, because shame thrives in shadows, but justice blooms in daylight. And so my story ends not in sorrow, but in renewal. For though I had walked dangerously close to the edge of betrayal and even death, I had emerged stronger, freer, and more certain of myself than ever before. The doctor's 5 frantic words, scribbled on a slip of paper and hidden in my bag, became the turning point of my life, the spark that lit the fire of my survival. And now, when I look around my quiet home, I see not a prison of manipulation, but a sanctuary of my own making. The moral is simple and clear, as sharp as glass and as steady as stone. Never mistake kindness for weakness, because the day a gentle woman decides to stand, the liars and bullies who fed on her silence will be the ones forced to sit down. Justice may not come quickly, but it always comes surely, and when it does, it restores the balance with a sweetness that lingers long after the bitterness is gone. And before I finish, I want to speak straight from the heart. If this story touched you, if it made you angry or made you smile when justice finally came, let me know. Leave me a comment. Tell me what part hit you the hardest, because I truly love reading your thoughts and feeling that we're all in this together. And if you give this story a like or hit subscribe, it means the world to me. It's what helps me keep creating more of these stories for women like us, stories where truth wins and kindness proves stronger than betrayal. Thank you for being here with me. Your support is the reason I keep going.